Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you already heard, I'm a professor of history at the University of Memphis, and I've been teaching here since 2000. So this is my 20th year teaching at the University of Memphis. And yeah, so what I'm going to do today is talk about how to request a letter of recommendation from my perspective as a professor. So I'm sure if maybe somebody from CareerServices or one of the other advising centers on campus would do, maybe their advice might be different, but the advice I'm going to give you is based on how I, as a professor, feel a student should ask for a letter of recommendation, how a student should approach a professor and request a recommendation. So this is coming from that perspective. I'm going to cover three main kind of general topics today, which are now coming on your screen: getting to know your professor, communicating with your professor, and informing your professor. So I'm going to go into more detail about each of those three topics. But the first one is basically we'll talk a little bit about why it's important for you to kind of establish a professional relationship with your professor before you even get to the point where you need a recommendation. The second topic, we'll talk about how you should interact with your professor, how you should email and meet with them and things like that. And then the last topic will be about how you should help your professor with the right information so that they write a good recommendation for you. So I'll go into more detail about each of those topics. And at the end, if you have any questions or comments, we can have some time for that. So I hope everybody can hear me. And if I'm going too fast or you can't hear me very well, please let us know. I don't know if you can write in the chat option or something like that, or you can come on the screen, but just let us know if you're having difficulty hearing me or following me. Okay, let's start with the first one, getting to know your professor. Or another way to phrase that is help your professor get to know you. It's actually a lot easier for you to get to know your professor because you see them every class meeting and you observe them. You usually quickly kind of figure out their kind of habits or the things they do or what they wear or whatever. So it's actually easier for a group of people listening to one professor to get to know that person better than it is for the professor to get to know you, the students in the class. So every class is a little different, as you know. Sometimes there's maybe only 5 or 10 or 15 students in the class. Sometimes you have a very large class. I teach a class every semester that has 165 students, about 165 students in an auditorium. So it's not possible for me to know all of those students in the class. The only way I get to know students is if they participate in class and if they come to see me during office hours. So I think that's really important. If you think you're going to need a recommendation at some point in the future, it's a good idea to get to know your professor before that point. And especially if it's a professor in your major. The most important letters recommendation you're going to get are from the professors in your major. So that's the relationships you especially want to establish. How do you do that? Well, number one, as I mentioned, you should participate in class. It's a lot easier for a professor to get to know a student who raises their hand, contributes to discussion, is an active participant in the class. A student who kind of sits in the corner, never raises their hand, never says anything, is a student that won't strike a professor, won't be somebody that they're going to remember. So, there's a limit to that. You don't want to be somebody that's always raising your hand, always talking. That could be annoying for a professor as well. So you don't want to go to the extreme of being a try-hard, like my son likes to say. But you want to be a student that the professor sees participates in class. That's important because, sometimes I have students ask me for a recommendation and I can't remember who they are. I don't know. All I know is they got an A in the class or they got an A minus, but I can't really say anything beyond that. All I can say is, oh, they got a good grade in my class. But if they were a student that I remember always participated in class discussion, I can also say, this was a really good student who made a good impression on me. The other way you can get to know your professor is by taking advantage of office hours. Every professor is supposed to have office hours. That's a time where you as a student are allowed to go to the professor's office and meet with them unannounced. Every professor is supposed to inform students when those office hours are, and every professor is supposed to have office hours listed on their syllabus. So if you take any of my classes, at the top of the syllabus, it'll say, I'm available Wednesdays, 2:30 to 4:30, and Fridays, 11:30 to 12, or by appointment. And that means that during those times I have listed on the syllabus, you can just come to my office and meet with me. Or if those times don't work with you, you can send me an email and request a different time, and I'll try to figure something out with you. Now, every professor is different. Some professors have an open door policy. You can just walk in whenever you want to. Some professors, like me, prefer that you come during the office hours, the times I have designated for that. Some professors are not very nice, and maybe if you show up during their office hours, they don't even want to meet with you. But that's something you learn from experience. But officially, office hours are meant to be a time where you can go to your professor, and sometimes I have students say, can you please help me with my paper? I need some advice. Sometimes students will come to say, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm a new student here, wanted to meet you. Sometimes a student might come because they want some advice on what their major should be or something like that. Sometimes a student will come because they're asking for a recommendation. So you should take advantage of office hours. What's good about that is that when you do that while you're taking a class, the professor will more likely remember you even better than if you were just a student in the class that did well. So sometimes I'll have a student ask me for a recommendation, and I'll remember, oh yeah, I remember the student, they came to meet with me. They're from Jordan or they're from Columbia, and they told me what they're hoping to major in, and that'll make me be able to write a better recommendation. So the point of this is that you want to establish a professional relationship with your professor before you need a recommendation, right? And you can be strategic about this. You don't have to get to know every professor, but definitely the professors in your major. Definitely the professors you take more than one class with. Those are the professors you want to get to know so that in the future, you're definitely going to need a recommendation, right? You're definitely going to apply for a job. You're definitely going to apply for a scholarship. You're definitely going to apply to continue your education. And you want to make sure that you have a few professors that know you really well and that can write a strong letter, okay? Good, let's move on to the next main point, and that's communicating with your professor. Now, again, every professor is different. Some professors are very informal. They don't mind if you call them by their first name. Other professors are more formal. I tend to be more formal. I want students to call me Professor Laumann. And I think as a professor, it's always better for students to be more formal, to be safe, right? Maybe a professor might tell you, oh, you can call me, Mary or John or Keisha or whatever. But it's better to start off being more formal. I think it makes a better impression on your professor when you see that you're professional in your communications. What do I mean by communications? I mean emails, meeting with your professor in the office. I think for most of you international students, in my experience, usually are respectful and professional and formal, and I think that's a good thing. Most of the time, American students tend not to be. So I think it's always good to make a very good impression on your professors from the start by being professional and respectful. And that's important because you should ask for permission from your professor for a recommendation before you write down your professor's name on an application. Okay, this is important. I think it's polite to reach out to your professor and say, hey, professor, I'm going to be applying for a scholarship. Do you mind if I put your name down as a reference? I don't like it when I get an email in my inbox from a scholarship organization or an employer saying that this student requested a recommendation from you. And that student never asked me if I was willing to write the recommendation. That right away makes a poor impression on me, because you should always ask first, do you mind if I put your name and your email on an application I'm doing? Will you be willing to write me a recommendation? That's very important. I have one student who took a class with me many, many years ago, more than 10 years ago, and didn't even do well in the class. And every year I get emails requesting a recommendation for him from graduate programs, from jobs, and he never asks me for permission. He never explains to me what he's doing. He never tells me anything about the applications. So I just have to delete those requests because I don't even know what the application is for or what the student has done since they graduated. So always ask for permission first. How do you do that? I think the best way is to meet with your professor. Go to their office hours and explain to them, hi, professor, I'm in your class, or I took your class last year and I'm going to be applying for a scholarship. Would you be willing to write me a recommendation? I think that's a good idea to do that because then you remind the professor who you are, they get to see you. And if the professor has any questions, you can answer them right then and there, right? So usually when a student does that with me, I'll say, oh, I'm very happy to write a recommendation for you. Please email me the details and I'll take care of it. The other way to ask for permission is to just email your professor. Sometimes you have to do that because maybe you can't meet with them. Maybe you're not in the class anymore, so you don't know when their office hours are, or maybe you're, like in this situation, you're at home, you're learning remotely. When you email your professor, say, hey, dear Dr. Laumann, I was a student in your class last semester. I'm applying for a job. I wanted to ask you if I could put your name down on the application for a reference. So always ask for permission. And I think, you need to give your professor advance notice. I'm surprised sometimes students think they can ask you for a letter and you're going to write it in 24 hours. I think everybody's busy. I don't want to say professors are more busy than anybody else, but usually I have a to-do list for the whole week. And every day I take care of things I have to do. And usually I have a bunch of letters of recommendation to write. So when you ask me, I probably have 5 or 6 or 10 or 2 students who ask me before you, and I have to do theirs first. So if you think you're going to need a recommendation, you need to plan in advance. If the letter is due, let's say right now it's July 17, let's say your letter is due September 1st, go see your professor or email your professor a month ahead of time so that they have time to write the letter and take care of it before the deadline. But I think at least 2 weeks notice is the best thing. Sometimes a scholarship, you learn about a scholarship at the last minute, or somebody invites you to apply for a job and you have to do your application quickly. That can happen. If it happens, email your professor and say, dear professor, I'm very sorry. This is short notice. I just found out about this today. Would you be willing to write a recommendation? I understand if you can't. But the best thing is to plan ahead. Let me say a few words about the different kinds of recommendations there are. So there's different things. The most traditional kind of recommendation is a letter. Your professor writes a letter to the scholarship committee or to the job or to the graduate program you're applying to. And usually those are longer. The professor is going to say, how do they know you? This was a student in my class. This student was active. They got an A. They wrote a really good paper. They did a really good research project. They worked in my lab. And they'll say why they think you deserve the job or the scholarship or the position. Sometimes what you're applying to simply requires a form, like a form with a checklist or just very short answers. Sometimes those forms are physical papers. Sometimes they're by email. But even with those, you want to let your professor know in advance. Don't just send a form to your professor and say, can you please fill this out? Email your professor first and say, I'm applying for a position. Would you be willing to fill out a form, right? Give them advance notice. Sometimes a recommendation is over the phone. That's usually for a job. And again, ask your professor first before you give their phone number to anybody, right? Sometimes I get a phone call in my office and they'll say, oh, your student said you would recommend them, but I don't know anything about it. I don't know what the job is, or the student didn't ask for my permission. Make sure you do that first. Sometimes students ask for a very general letter that a professor will write, and that student will use that letter for all kinds of things, scholarships, jobs, positions. That's a very convenient thing to do, because then you have a letter, a standard letter that you can use for anything, and you don't have to ask your professor each time for a different letter. There's a service called Interfolio, for example, where the professor posts the letter and then you can use it for anything you apply for. The negative about a general letter is that it's general. A letter that's specific to a scholarship or job is always going to be stronger, because the people reading it think that the professor wrote it specifically for that job or that position or that scholarship. So you can ask for a general letter, but I think a specific letter for that particular application is stronger. Excuse me. There are two terms, recommendation and reference, and I want to make a brief comment about that. Technically, a recommendation is where a professor is saying, I recommend this student for this award or this scholarship or this job. A reference is more general. I know this student, they're a good student. The truth is, I think people kind of use these terms interchangeably. So if somebody's asking for a reference, somebody's asking for a recommendation, it's usually the same thing. People just kind of use the two terms for the same reason. Another thing you have to consider is whether, usually with a recommendation, you're asked, will you allow the recommender to make their recommendation confidentially or non-confidentially? What that means is, if it's confidential, the letter that I write for you, you won't be able to read it. It's just between me and the person, the organization that's asking for the recommendation. If it's non-confidential, that means that you would be able to have access to my recommendation. If you ask the employer or the scholarship office, can I see the letter that Dr. Laumann wrote? They can let you look at it. But if you check off confidential, that means that I'm writing to the organization and you can't look at it. I prefer confidential, not because I'm going to say something that I don't want you to know about, but it allows me to be more open with my recommendation. It allows me to, I don't know, I don't want to say be more honest, but if I know you're going to read it, maybe I'll be a little more restrained in my recommendation. And I think it makes the employer or the grant agency or the graduate program have more confidence in the letter if you opted for it to be confidential. If they know that you allowed the professor to submit the recommendation confidentially, they will feel stronger about your application. If you have any questions about that, we can talk some more at the end. Okay, so the point of this part of the presentation was that you want to provide advance notice, and you want to give the details to your professor when you request a recommendation. What are you applying for? What kind of form is it going to be? Is it going to be a letter, an email, a call? Am I going to check off confidential? Let your professor know. And so they can say to you, yes, I'll write it. Sometimes a professor will say no. Maybe the professor says no, not because they don't like you, but maybe because they don't feel like they have enough information to write you a strong recommendation. Or sometimes a professor is just a jerk and they don't want to write a recommendation. That could happen too. But you want to know that in advance. That's why you ask them. The worst thing is if you put down a professor's name and then they never write a recommendation. Why don't they write the recommendation? Because you never asked them. Or maybe they're just not good about that. Maybe they tell people, I don't write recommendations. So you want to communicate with your professor first. Okay, the last major point, inform your professor. Give your professor information that will help them write the best letter they can write. If you just say, Professor, can you write a recommendation for me? I was in your class last semester, and that's it. It's going to be a very vague, weak letter. But the more information you give me, the stronger my letter is going to be. If you give me details about what you're applying for, who you are, I'm going to put that in the letter, right? So first of all, once you've met with your professor, or once you emailed your professor and they said, yes, I'll write the recommendation, then you email them this information that I'm telling you now. Remind them of your relationship. Remind them what classes you were in, what semesters they were, what grades you got, right? Hi, Dr. Laumann, I was in your world history class in fall 2019, I got an A. I took your West African history class in spring 2020, I got an A-. Remind them, because they can't remember all this. They have hundreds of students. And it's not easy to look that information up. So give them that information so that they have it for the letter. Remind them of any other interactions you might have had with the professor. Tell them, oh, I wrote a great paper on it. Maybe not a great paper, I wrote a paper in your class on this topic. Or I was an intern in your department. Or I assisted in your lab. Or I'm also involved in this student group that you are the faculty advisor for. Remind them of how you know them, because every professor and every letter recommendation has to explain, how do they know this person? This student was in my class. I worked with this student on a project. This student is very active in this organization. Give the professor any relevant information about yourself that'll help them with the letter. Remind them of what your major is, what your GPA is, when you expect to graduate. I won't know that unless you tell me. I don't know everybody's major when they're planning to graduate. Tell them what your academic or career plans are. Sometimes that helps the professor write a strong letter. They can say, this scholarship would be really beneficial to the student because they're planning on becoming a teacher, and this will give them a good opportunity to develop their knowledge. Or this graduate program is perfect for the student because they were a bio major and I know they're planning to go technology, something like that. It's not a bad idea to also send your professor a resume or maybe a brief statement about yourself that'll help them write the recommendation. So I always, when I write a recommendation for a student, I always look, what information did they give me? Let me take a look at the resume. Sometimes I'll see something on the resume, on your resume, that I'll put in the letter to strengthen the recommendation. Lastly, you want to give them specific details about the recommendation you ask them to write, okay? So tell them, what is the name of the scholarship you're applying for? What is the position you're applying for? What is the graduate program called? What degree are you going to get? What are you hoping to get? Give them the information so they know exactly what they're writing the recommendation for. Tell them who the letter should be addressed to. Sometimes the letter should be addressed to a specific person. Sometimes it's addressed to a committee. They need to know that. Remind them about how the letter should be submitted. Is the professor supposed to upload the letter at a website? Are they supposed to mail it? Should they email it to somebody? Make sure the professor doesn't have to look around for that information. You give it to them. And then remind them about when the recommendation is due or when your application is due. Sometimes scholarships or jobs or whatever don't have a specific deadline, but you could tell your professor, I'm planning to submit my application August 1st. That way the professor knows, okay, I should try to get it in by August 1st as well, okay? So give them information that they need. So the point of this is you want to help your professor write a strong recommendation. The more information you give your professor, the better the recommendation they can write. Okay, a few final points, and then we can open it up to questions or comments if you have any. I think it's a good idea to follow up with your professor. Most students ask for a recommendation, and then you never hear from them again. I admire and respect students who follow up with me. There's two ways to do that. Send your professor a thank you email. Say, hey, professor, I just wanted to thank you for writing that recommendation for me. I appreciate it. There's nothing wrong with showing appreciation, right? It makes a good impression on your professor. It shows the professor you're serious. And you know, you want to continue that relationship because you might ask for more letters in future. If you get that application, if you succeed, maybe that professor wrote you a really good letter, you want to ask them again. And that also relates to this point. Let them know what happened. I respect students who will email and say, hey, Dr. Laumann, I want to let you know I didn't get that scholarship, but I really appreciate that you wrote a letter. I hope you don't mind if I ask you again someday. Or, hey, Professor Laumann, I have great news. I got the job. Thanks for your help. Let the professor know. Sometimes I always wonder, did that student get into the program? Did that student get that scholarship? Let them know, because the professor took time to write a letter for you. I think you could take a few minutes to let them know when you receive a decision. Good, so how about we open it up if people have questions or comments? I don't know if you guys do that.